All right, well, greetings and welcome to Advocating for Ourselves, Working in Underrepresented and Multicultural Archives and Libraries, a program of the Rare Book School's Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage. My name is Clint Fluker, and I'm the curator of African American collections at the Stuart Rose Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Book Library at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and a Cultural Heritage Fellow myself. Today, we have a wonderful conversation planned for you featuring some amazing speakers who not only do the important work of advocacy every day, but they have been, they've just carved off a lot of time to share their experiences and their advice with us, which is just amazing. And for that, we really are most appreciative. Before we introduce the panel and get into the discussion, I wanted to take some time to frame this program and give some shout outs and thank yous. This event today is the product of the great work being done by the Rare Book School and the Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage. The purpose of the fellowship is to advance multicultural collections through innovative and inclusive curatorial practice and leadership by providing professional development opportunities for early to mid-career professionals currently working in a special collections library, archive, or other cultural heritage institution. As fellows gathered from all across the country, we engage in a series of activities and programs that enable us to develop skills, raise awareness about multicultural collections, build connections with diverse communities, and advance our careers by establishing new pathways for professional growth. One of our main activities this year was to participate in working groups dedicated to challenging action items in special collections and archives. Our working group is dedicated to the theme of advocacy in its many forms, and that can take the form of outreach, reparative description, mentorship, financial development, and many, many others. And here you see a list of the names of each member of our working group and their institutional affiliations. And I wanted to put this on here because while I'm speaking to all of you today, I represent all of the collective efforts of all of these individuals. Their work here was done over months and through weekly meetings, after work phone calls, and exhaustive research to bring you this program today. And so I want to make sure that you see them and also say their names aloud. So Megan Alston, Ellen Ray Cachola, Azelia Camacho, Yao Chin, myself, Lorena Gotro, Delisa Minor Harris, Rosa Pena, Jasmine Six Conk, and Margarita Vargas Betancourt. As a group, our objective was to study what advocacy means to us in our respective jobs and put together a program that would serve as a tool for others interested in learning more about the topic. The result of this work is really twofold. The first is a digital publication, free and publicly available online, titled Advocating for Ourselves, Working in Underrepresented and Multicultural Archives and Libraries. Each fellow submitted a different chapter on a theme related to advocacy in archives and libraries. This publication aims to provide a practical guide to assist cultural heritage workers to practice and improve their advocacy skills by providing our colleagues facing similar challenges around the country with specific examples and resources that they can delve into. The link to this publication is here and will be shared in the chat. And it was a long journey to create this publication. And though each one of the fellows who I mentioned before is a brilliant person in their own right, we did not do it alone. And so at this time, I'd also like to thank the Rare Book School, the Mellon Cultural Heritage Fellowship, and in particular, Curtis Small, Marian Toledo Candelaria, Barbara Heritage, Danielle Culpepper, and our outside peer reviewers for making this publication and this whole day possible. And this is the reason you're all here, not to listen to me, so I will move quickly from here on. The second result of our advocacy working group is this panel discussion, featuring Lauren Cooper, Jonna Paden, and Mario Ramirez, who promised us the most exciting Zoom conversation about advocacy you have ever seen or heard. It's going to be wild. I'm joking, it's going to be very informative. Before I introduce them, I'll ask that everyone in this audience be sure to keep their mics on mute. And after the last presentation, we will open the floor for questions for the audience. And the easiest way to do this is by digitally raising your hand and just waiting for me or one of my colleagues to call on you, or you can type your question in the chat to be read by Rosa Pena, who is also one of the fellows. And now for an introduction to the panelists. Lauren Cooper is the Digital Scholarship Librarian and Managing Director for the Center for Black Digital Research and #DigBlack or DigBlack at Penn State University. Lauren works with students, faculty, librarians, and partners to implement, develop, and manage digital scholarship and publishing projects that bring 19th century Black organizing to digital life. Lauren has an MLIS degree from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a specialization in archives and digital curation, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Redlands in visual sociology. Jonna Paden is librarian and archivist at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center Library and Archives in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she has been previously a student and community intern. She has worked as an independent library and archives consultant, and since 2020, has been a chair of the New Mexico Library Association's Native American Library Special Interest Group. She holds an MLIS in Archive Studies and Records Management from San Jose State University. And last but not least is Mario Ramirez, who is the head of Special Collections and Archives at the California State University, Los Angeles. He received a PhD in Information Studies and a certificate in Experimental Critical Theory from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2017. Previously, he held appointments as project archivist at the Bancroft Library at University of California, Berkeley, and the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, CUNY. Wow. All right, y'all. I told you we were lucky to have him. I'm excited. I'm going to sit back and listen. Thank you all for being here again. And Lauren, after you get set up, please take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you see the slide okay? Great. Hello everyone, thank you for being here and thank you all for inviting me. My name is Lauren Cooper, pronouns she, her. I am Muskogee Indian or Creek of the Creek Nation, currently of Oklahoma, formerly of Georgia, and Akimo O'odham of the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. As Clint mentioned, I'm the Digital Scholarship Librarian and Managing Director for the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State University. The center, the team members you can see here, the Center for Black Digital Research, or DigBlack as we call it, as in digitize Black history, dig and unbury Black history, and dig Black history, is focused on building accessible online archives related to the 19th and 20th century Black organizing. Our team is an interdisciplinary cross-ranked group numbering 30 to 35 people, comprised of undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, faculty, librarians, and partners. DigBlack is committed to developing and modeling practices of reciprocal partnerships with institutions and communities in the work of recovering Black history. We are intentionally collaborative and horizontally structured. To give you a picture of what that looks like, when we return to being in person, our method is to meet weekly with food provided for everyone. We arrange our seats in a circle for announcements, information sharing, and to meet invited guests or collaborators. We then break into our committees, which are generally chaired by students, but in some cases they co-chair with other students or with faculty, librarians, and partners. My role is to advise on or lead digital scholarship and publishing projects and to manage the digital orbits. As managing director, I help drive the implementation of the center's strategic goals, ensuring that we deliver on the center partnerships and collaborations, and oversee our organizational, financial, and technical infrastructures to meet our immediate and long-term needs. The center is home to 3 signature projects. The longest running is the Colored Conventions Project, or CCP. CCP features a database housing the meeting minutes, speeches, and related records, as well as 18 digital exhibits that featured the Colored Conventions movement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later in the presentation. The Black Women's Organizing Archive is our newest project, which brings the scattered archives of Black organizing figures together. That would be Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Ann Shad Carey, Mary Church Terrell, and Frances Harper. And Douglas Day is our annual international event held every February 14th on Frederick Douglass's chosen birthday, where we crowdsource transcribing these Black history documents we've collected. Core and critical to our work is a set of principles that we wrote collectively and published last September. They grow out of the CCP principles, which again, I'll talk about a bit later. These principles guide the work we do and how we do it and the choices we make. This is a living document, one meant to offer accountability to each other, our partners, and the communities and fields we work in. And they guide us in advocating for the people we engage with and ensuring the ethical curation and stewardship of digital projects. My presentation is visual representation, breaking practice, shifting focus, and centering communities. I'll share some examples of how we engage in anti-racist and anti-sexist praxis in the development of digital interfaces, the impact of creating space to question and critique, and then talk about listening to the core community, which is something I'm always trying to be mindful about and heed to. As a Native American woman who's a senior member working in a Black History Center, I'll share a bit of what that looks like when the people and communities you're representing are not your own. So a bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree in visual sociology, struggle and resistance. I then spent 20 years in publishing, both print and digital, working at social justice organizations whose missions were to amplify the voices, communities, and histories that are hidden, missing, marginalized, and silenced, be it in newspapers, magazines, books, or the classroom. In the bottom right are a few of the profile projects I worked on at the Zen Education Project. And it's actually through researching for these projects and trying to, one, just find images, and two, find images that weren't stereotypical or demeaning or of subjugation, that I was inspired to earn my master's in library science with an emphasis on archives and digital curation. In 2018, I became a librarian. Through this work and experience, I think it's important to regularly ask, is this right, just, and respectful? I've trained myself to ask questions such as, is this recirculating stereotypical representations? Have we or I tried to move the visual narrative beyond the expected? Who's being prioritized in this image or graphic? How am I encouraging feedback? And when it's received, how will we or I incorporate it and respond? And then what do we need to do to meet experts where they're at and make the partnership of reciprocity and not extraction? So I'm going to shift into some examples of the work we've done with the Colored Conventions projects and digital interfaces. So CCP, the Colored Conventions project, is the longest running of the three projects, as I mentioned. The Colored Conventions movement started in 1830 and spanned 7 decades. This movement convened hundreds of state and national colored conventions across the US and in Canada. These political gatherings offered opportunities for Black people, some free and some enslaved, to organize and strategize for racial justice. The Colored Conventions project brings this varied history of Black activism to digital life, specifically digitizing, transcribing, and publishing the scattered archive of meeting minutes and related records. From this work, students and faculty create digital exhibits to highlight the lives and impact of these conventions. CCP's work is guided by a set of principles. As I mentioned earlier, the center has a set of principles that drew on the set of principles CCP already had in place. Specific to this presentation is Principle 2. We pledge to account for Black women's labor and leadership in our own historical work and in our own project practices. Principle 3, our project aims to highlight and center Black lives. And Principle 5, we seek to name Black people and communities as an affirmation of the Black humanity inherent in Black data and Black data curation. So I'm going to start with a migration project from back in 2018. When I joined CCP, my main focus was to project manage the completion of a website migration that had already been in progress for 2 years. The new sites were supposed to be launched in May, and it was October, so the pressure was already pretty high to launch. Picture here are some of the team, or all of the team members from that time period, 2018 to 2020. I want to recognize their labor and contributions: Caitlin Tannis, Amani Morrison, Kadera Henry, Brianna Richardson, Rachel Nelson, Caleb Trotter, and Jim Casey. The larger pictures are myself and Kelly Coles in the middle, a PhD candidate who had just returned from a year away and who was one of the new co-chairs of the website committee, and Michelle Burns on the right, an undergraduate and the other new co-chair of the website committee. So we're all new in our roles in the management of this project. We were contending with a bunch of missing content from the exhibits that didn't get transferred from our old Omeka Classic site to the new WordPress site. So we spent spring 2019 migrating the content, and we were noticing several design issues in the new layouts that made it challenging for visitors to engage with and didn't abide by our principles. And we found ourselves asking, is this making it a challenge for people and communities to engage with? If we're trying to present the lived lives to the descendants of these ancestors, are we then creating digital barriers in doing so? And if so, what do we need to do to make this buried history readily available, to account for Black women's labor and leadership, to highlight and center Black lives, and to affirm the humanity? By having these principles and creating the space to ask, is this just right and respectful, we could be accountable to our principles and to the lived lives we were presenting. Although we felt like we couldn't handle another delay, it was also clear that we needed to recalibrate to make the time to address the exhibit layouts and their visual representation. So first, some of the issues we ran into is a lot of the information, namely pop-up buttons, image galleries, and timelines and maps were hidden under pop-up windows. You had to click a button to open another window to see them. So here's an example of a button that pops open an interactive map. Not only did this pop-up feature hide the map and the historical content, but it was also requiring additional steps or clicks to access, made it hard to cite or link directly to the information, made the content hard to find for visually challenged or technically challenged audiences. It would be easy to miss if you're just scrolling through the page. And it was also taking the history we had unburied and now reburying it behind a digital wall. So we decided to take these visualizations out of the pop-up button and we integrated it into the page layout. This allows viewers to see there are visuals, different ways to engage, and also highlights the digital scholarship done to bring this history to digital life. So we're also being accountable to the student labor that went into this. Second, in the exhibits that were rich with personal biographies, namely women's biographies, they were bundled together on a single page. The reason was to keep the menu structure simple. However, these pages were long scrolls to get through and to see everyone represented. And as with the visualizations, they were hard to cite and make a direct link to. So Kelly, Michelle, and I discussed what we wanted to do and weighed the benefits and obstacles. We decided to create space. We decided to create separate pages for each of the women's biographies, so their names would be visible in the menu navigation. This set us back a couple of weeks, but we felt it was critically important to do so. Shown on the right is an example of where we made one web page into several web pages. Again, asking ourselves, is this right, just, and respectful? By having these conversations, we learned from each other, which we then carried forward in our future development work and future training of students who came into the committee. In our end of the semester report, as we accounted for our time delay, Kelly eloquently wrote that we took the extra time because consolidated pages were causing women's names, lives, and contributions to be in a bulk bin of information. Their name isn't seen in the exhibit menu, and you have to dig through a page. The layout doesn't provide their lives the digital space their male counterparts may receive, or give their lived lives the oxygen and spaces they may have struggled for. And then the third example is how we were visually representing histories. We were preparing the exhibit overview page, seen here on the right, and it gave me pause that for our exhibit on the colored conventions in the carceral states, we were using an image of a child chain gang. This image was troubling because it could reinforce the stereotype of Black males in prison, especially the stereotype of young Black males in prison. And if someone was scanning this page, they would be left with this visual impression about the exhibit. Using this as our featured image also missed an opportunity to highlight the exhibit's actual narrative, which was the colored convention movement's protest against the justice systems of California and Georgia. Black women reformers in the 1800s who contributed to the resistance against incarceration and the legacy of this protest. I raised this to Kelly and Michelle, asking what they thought. By taking that moment to pause and pose the question, we then asked if there's a better image we can use. And we chose to feature these two women, Selena Sloan Butler, an education activist who is well known for her critiques and condemnation of Georgia's incarceration system, and Ethel Wilson, a woman of financial means that was demonized by the media and ultimately convicted of a crime, even though it lacked physical evidence. So in the end, we went through all of our exhibits to reassess the images we're using, and this is what our exhibit page looks like now. So I'm going to pause here because you might be asking, well, if your work is guided by these principles, how is it that unflattering images were used in the first place and information and history was being reburied under digital features? There are a few reasons for this. There is that tension between trying to get the websites done and then taking the time to making sure we're being respectful with our representations and accountable to the communities we were representing. Having a process of review and feedback where critique is seen as a means to strengthen the work we're building on. Being able to create a working environment where people feel comfortable discussing these issues, and the leadership or senior people willing to engage in the conversation and take appropriate action, even if that means delays. So in this case, I was a senior member, but I felt it was my role in order to build this culture of practice, an environment to question and engage, to do that by asking open-ended questions and share my concerns, share my own uncertainty and ask what I'm missing or what are we missing, ask what others think, and to make space and invite people in with their ideas to build a consensus. And this also means being open to pushback, contrary opinions, and listening to people with different expertise. And at the end of the day, really listening to the core community. It takes humility when you're presenting people and cultures that are not your own. So I'm going to share an example of what that looks like. It had been 2 years. We finished the websites and we finally launched in January 2020. We wrote a blog series to document the behind the scenes work, and it was written in chronological order. In the order we proceeded through this work, it was ready to be rolled out as follows: project management, platform decisions and implementation, quality assurance, URLs and scholarly implications, parts 1 and 2, and ensuring digital space for Black women and access to Black histories. Myself, Kelly, and Michelle wrote all of these and edited them. We presented the rollout to the rest of the CCP team, and 2 African-American senior faculty members, Drs. Gabrielle Foreman and Kim Gallen, told us, no way should Black women be last on the list. My immediate response is, they're not last, we have more coming. That's just where it ended at this moment. The narrative structure won't fit if we move it around. And they followed up with, nope, you need to rearrange it. As a Black female academic, if I saw that on someone's page, it would signal to me where their priorities are and how they prioritize Black women. And they were absolutely right. It hadn't occurred to me. Despite my experience and practice, I was so focused on attending to prescriptive publishing standards and being chronological that I was being defensive instead of hearing them. Clearly, they had a strong reaction to seeing Black women listed last. So this hits on the issue of professional protocols or practices deemed superior over the voices and priorities of the community being represented. And this gets to the breaking practice part of my presentation. Our educational, professional, and technical expertise is only one part of the work. And so what I advocate is for using our training and expertise to find ways that things can be done differently in different ways, to not be gatekeepers, but to be collaborators. In the end, it would take some time to rearrange the post, 20 to 30 minutes, but the impact and visual significance, and more than that, the mutual respect will be long lasting. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that presentation. Let me get mine up and going here. Oh, that's okay, good, great. That's the right button. All right, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this session on advocating for ourselves. My name is Jonna Paden. I am from the Pueblos of Acoma and Laguna in Western New Mexico. My presentation today is Responsibility, Representation, and Respect in a Tribal Archives and Library. I am the librarian and archivist at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque. The center sits on the former grounds of the Albuquerque Indian School. The land is owned by the 19 Pueblos and includes several commercial enterprises. I have an almost 20-year history here that starts in 1995, and I have seen the center grow and change over the decades. The mission of the center is to preserve and perpetuate Pueblo culture and to advance understanding by presenting with dignity and respect the accomplishments and evolving history of the Pueblo people of New Mexico. The current purpose statement of the library and archives reflects and supports the IPCC's mission by collecting and preserving Pueblo history and culture, and to provide informational resources to educate and understand the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico and the Indigenous peoples of North America. The center represents the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico and includes within its collections materials of the Hopi Pueblo in Arizona, the Salado del Sur in Texas, and our neighboring Diné and Apache communities.
I'm sorry, Jonna, real quick. We can't see your PowerPoint.
Oh, no. Okay.
Your screen. We apologize.
I guess it helps to share the screen, right?
It's all good.
There we go. Let's see. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me put that up here. Okay, there we go. That better. Okay, so allow me to give a brief introduction to myself. I am new to libraries and archives. As I said, I've been at the IPCC for some time. I started out as a receiver of merchandise for the retail stores. More than 10 years after starting college and leaving, I never said quit because I always knew I was going to go back. In early 2002, I went back to the University of New Mexico to complete a bachelor's degree, which I did in December of 2006. My son was born in June of 2007, and I took time off to care for him. During that time, I wondered what to do when I returned to work. I had created a degree that concentrated on several options. Writing and linguistics were two of those options. So sometime in my senior year, I'd heard about the Honoring Generation Scholarship at the University of Texas, Austin for a Master of Science in Information Studies, but the deadline to apply for the last cohort would finish before I graduated from UNM. I had also heard of the University of Arizona's Knowledge River cohort, but I wondered, what can you do with an information science degree? Well, you could become an archivist. And there was an archives down the hall from me here at the center, open one day a week to the public. As I learned more about archives, I thought that is what I want to do. And being a librarian wouldn't be bad either. So I happened across information for the Circle of Learning Scholarship at San Jose State University. Best of all, it was an online program and I wouldn't have to move. I applied to the program and San Jose State and returned to the center as a volunteer in the library and archives as I waited to hear if I'd been accepted. I was part of the second cohort for the Circle of Learning. I had so many amazing American Indian Alaska Native classmates from Alaska to Maryland, many who'd been working in libraries and archives for years. From them, I learned so much, as well as the Native information professionals and mentors that we were introduced to. That learning has continued with the many Native and non-Native information professionals I have met and at the conferences I have attended, notably the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, or ATALM. Each of these pieces has informed my work and helped me in my stewardship of archive materials and understanding the flaws and difficulties of Western information systems. One of the many research papers that I wrote was titled "The Effect of LCC and LCSH on Information Representation for American Indian and Indigenous Cultures." I did a poster presentation of that paper at the 2012 ATALM conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a PowerPoint presentation at the 2013 ATALM conference at Tamaya, New Mexico. I am in my third term as the chair of NALSIG. My goal there is to support and facilitate conversation between tribal librarians, library vendors, and other interested parties, as well as hear updates on state legislative funding, issues like the Yazzie and Martinez versus State of New Mexico lawsuit, which has garnered funding for tribal libraries, which are a necessity in tribal communities. I joined the committees at the Society of Southwest Archivists to be an Indigenous voice at the table and to highlight the work of BIPOC archivists and archives. I am grateful to be welcomed by my peers. I was part of the team of tribal and non-tribal museum professionals that created, under the leadership of Landis Smith at the School of Advanced Research and Cynthia Chavez Lamar, then director of the Indian Arts and Research Center, now director of the National Museum of the American Indian. The guidelines offer principles and practical considerations for museums working with Native American communities and Native communities working with museums. Though geared toward Native communities and collection staff, the guidelines can be applied to a range of communities whose cultural materials are held by museums. I am also part of the Archives and Archivists group, a special interest group from the NMLA, and I have been the NMLA archivist since about 2015. My work experience includes archivist consultant for an Arthur Beeble map project at my Pueblo institution, the Sky City Cultural Center and Haku Museum, and as a library consultant at the Pueblo San Felipe Community Library. I have done presentations at conferences and a class or two. As an LSIG chair, I have written letters of support for the state library for funding proposals aimed at initiatives for tribal libraries. Best of all, I did a short study abroad class in 2013 titled Australian Contributions to Archival Theory and Practice with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where we traveled to Melbourne, Australia, and visited 14 different libraries and archives. I'm sure I'm missing a few things, but you don't need my full resume. The point of all of this is to say it's expanded. All of these experiences have expanded my education and allowed me to experience a range of perspectives, all of which inform me with my work. Now, the IPCC Library. The library and archives have gone through various changes since starting in 1976. Dr. and Mrs. Ted Sturm and Dr. Joe Sando of Jemez Pueblo are credited with starting the library and archive, which has also been known as the Institute for Pueblo Indian Studies. For many years, it was formally managed by Dr. Sando, the Sturms, and a team of volunteers. An ANA grant, an Administration for Native Americans grant, provided funding for a director and 3 student interns, of which I was one. A consecutive ANA grant continued to provide funding and helped to move the library into a larger space, which was a smaller space than this one shown here. So the library holds at least 5,000 books focused on Pueblo history and people and spans a range of subjects. There are also books on Southwest Native nations and other tribal nations throughout the US. More than half of the collection is from donations. Two collections of note are our children's and juvenile collections and our dissertations. My objectives when purchasing books is to have Native voices and perspectives present. I want to provide a selection of Native authored books about Native people and topics so that there is proper representation and that Indigenous perspective. There is weeding to do as the collection has some non-Native books as well as books that place us in the past or lack proper cultural representation. We also have a wonderful collection of theses and dissertations authored by Pueblo scholars and or on Pueblo topics. Here's a screenshot of our online catalog. We are in the process of doing inventory, which includes weeding books of a sensitive nature. There are subjects that tribal councils and governors are not comfortable having available for public access. As they are our shareholders and part of the board, we will respectfully honor that request. As we know, archaeologists and anthropologists, among others, have come into Native nations and recorded and documented a range of cultural things, ceremonies, songs, dances, private areas, and the taking of cultural objects. Often what has been documented has been used against us, influence laws and perceptions of us. So we guard against outside influence and loss. This is not censorship, but a protection of culture. I like what Native author Angeline Booley said at the American Library Association's LibLearnX conference. She said, "I write to preserve my culture and edit to protect it. So I work to preserve my Pueblo culture, but edit to protect it." There will also be a special access collection created from the problematic books that show prejudice and bias in the writing. For example, magazine articles from El Portal magazines and books that were written in the early 1930s. This collection can be used critically for comparison to recent years where proper representation and inclusion are more common. In regards to classification, as a research library, we use the Library of Congress subject headings, which we know are problematic in naming and location. Certainly, my goal is to organize the collection to a more equitable classification and proper naming system, but that is a huge job. So for now, I am choosing to use certain subject headings and not others. For example, using Pueblo of Sandia or Pueblo of Santo Domingo, and using instead Sandia Pueblo, or using the traditional name instead of the Spanish name. So Kiwa versus Santo Domingo Pueblo, Tamaya versus San Felipe Pueblo. In time, I would like to have a more Native-centered cataloging system like the Brian Deere classification system that's used by some First Nations collections and institutions in Canada. This is our archive. It certainly looks like we hold a lot of materials, but not all of it is fully processed. We have newspapers, a collection of photographs, some from various events here at the center, programs, and people. Photo collections include images from the Smithsonian, the First Americans pageant, and various Indian schools, including the Albuquerque Indian School campus here. We have VHS and a beta video collection, and we're part of the Community Archiving Workshop, a partnership with the Association of Moving Image Archivists and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We were provided workshops and a preservation plan that was created for us, and we will have 25 VHS videos preserved and digitized. We also hold various maps and architectural renderings of additions to the center. We have books from the Bureau of Ethnology dating back to the 1800s, a postcard collection that was donated by a longtime volunteer centered on Southwest and Pueblos, Dr. Sando's manuscripts, and several photo albums from the former Albuquerque Indian School, and a Friends collection. The Friends were a group of volunteers that oversaw a range of activities from funding for artwork and sculptures, lectures, and field trips, and so on. An often asked question is how to get online access to materials. So while at San Jose State, the Native cohort often had to educate classmates about the lack of internet services to tribal communities, among other things. We explained that even if we did have the infrastructure for an online presence, that didn't mean everything would go online for easy access. Thankfully, there is Mukutu, an open source content management system built with Indigenous communities in mind, which allows for access permissions to be set. As a small archive, we do not have the space to hold materials of each individual Pueblo. We prefer to keep general information and have the specific Pueblo be the caretaker of its own history and information. So new to the archive collection is an oral history project titled Journeys and Pathways, Contemporary Pueblo Women in Leadership, Service, and the Arts. 20 women from across 14 of the 19 Pueblos in various occupations share their stories of their childhood and their life experiences and how they came to their chosen career. As a community intern, I was excited to be a part of this work on this project because in many of the interviews, I heard a part of my own story. All of the interviews are online to view and to read the transcripts. The library blog, the Indigenous Connections and Collections, grew out of the pandemic as a way to reach out virtually to patrons. I wanted to highlight Pueblo history and to show all the wonderful work that is being done by both Pueblo and Indigenous people across the world. This includes Indigenous peoples of all colors. Each month, I focus on a theme and provide information and links to resources. It is my way of making sure we are seen and heard. That is my presentation and an introduction to me and to the work that I do. Work that in itself is daily advocacy. I am happy and content that my job is centered on work that I am passionate about. I am grateful to preserve and be a caretaker of my history. Here's my contact information. I am happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
I assume it's okay to go now. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Again, my name is Ramirez, and I'm currently head of special collections and archives at the California State University in Los Angeles. First, I really want to thank the Advocacy Working Group for their kind invitation to present and today on this panel, and also to be here with you. I'm always sort of very grateful and surprised when I used to receive these kinds of invitations. And it's even more wonderful because I get to share space with Jonna and Lauren and to hear about their really wonderful, fantastic work. And I've learned so much so far, and I really look forward to learning more from them in the future, in the near future, and also to learn from you in conversation and them with you in conversation in the sort of subsequent discussion that we'll have after these presentations. I have purposely kept my comments both informal and hopefully relatively brief. Because as anyone who knows me, I'm much more interested in having a conversation about these issues with you and having exchanging ideas instead of having my big face fill up your screen and lecture at you. So I'm really looking forward to the dialogue. So I'm sort of going to touch upon a few things as I move forward in my brief presentation, and then hopefully we'll get more time to discuss it afterwards. Now, I have probably well-earned reputation as someone who, as a friend of mine who's on this call or chat or whatever we want to call it, Zoom call, loquacious. So I encourage Clint and my co-panelists to tell me to stop and shut the hell up at some point in time. So, you know, when I was thinking about both the topic of our entire panel today in terms of advocating for ourselves and thinking, sort of trying to think around the title for my presentation today, which talks about mobilizing community partnerships through reciprocity and representation and self-representation. You know, it really got me reflecting on sort of the motivations and reasonings why I'm doing this at all. You know, as I tell many of our students who come here to Cal State LA and we do introductory to archives courses, I have no background in archives or history pre-late 90s / my late 20s to early 30s. My background is mainly in humanities. I worked a lot on sort of psychoanalytic theory and visual culture. And despite the fact that I was in and out of libraries most of my life, I had no sort of predisposition to look at sort of primary sources or the historical foundations of what we do. And it wasn't until I sort of stumbled upon the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in New York after a friend of mine recommended that I do some work there because I was too depressed and she thought I should do something interesting with my life, that I sort of became very curious about, archives. And really because of the fact that at a very fundamental level, they answered this question for me of like, what went into formulating and constructing and writing history, right? And as someone who is interested in theoretical ventures, but also interested in the praxis and perhaps some would call practical applications of these things or thinking of these things, it sort of really piqued my curiosity. And so I really owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and Librarian Archives and Pedro Hernandez, who was up until last year the senior archivist, and Nereida Perez, who was the library director at that point in time, for really inculcating me in the ways of archives in many ways. And I mentioned this because it was actually a very serendipitous and very fortunate happenstance that I landed at Centro. Certainly before arriving, I had a certain predisposition for or affiliation with social justice issues and activism, and had been active myself in various queer movements and racial justice movements. But I'd mainly sort of looked at those issues through the lens of a lot of the theoretical work I was doing and also a lot of political theory. So it was really interesting for me to land at Centro, which had been founded very much as an activist endeavor, an activist archive, and was really committed to communal work despite the fact that they were based at a university library. And that's really where I sort of started sowing the seeds of this interest in sort of what community partnerships look like or what they could look like, and really what sort of a very reciprocal approach to dealing with different community groups, but also moreover, and how that was very contributive and really seminal to the process of documenting BIPOC communities, and specifically in this instance, the Puerto Rican community. So, what I discovered along the way was how instrumental this sort of exchange, a sort of input and consultation was to the development of collections and programming, really a very sort of important sort of connective trust that existed between the repository, the sort of the process of documentation, and then the donors or the donor communities or sort of the stakeholders really of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at that point in time. And initially in those first few years, I was really a processing archivist. And so I was stuck in a room somewhere with several of my poor assistants, just sort of making my way through these collections. And I think it only, it was always obviously very evident to me that the work was impactful, but as my role grew there, and as I started sort of doing more programming and curating more exhibits and attending more events at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, that sort of very sort of the overarching impact of representation and community representation and self-representation became very evident to me, attending these exhibits or photography exhibits or exhibits of our work or our collections or programs where people had very visceral reactions to seeing their communities represented in a lot of the work that we were preserving in many respects. So, it would be family members, it would be individuals they remember from their particular communities in the Lower East Side or Manhattan or East Harlem. And so it was the sort of very tangibility was really astonishing to me and really sort of really stood out in many respects. And, you know, a few years back, I co-published an article in Marika Seafor and Michelle Caswell about something that we then termed representational belonging. And I think, you know, this sort of early sort of evidence of this was definitely present for me in the work that I was doing at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and seeing how just there was this resonance for people when it came to really like seeing themselves in the historical record, which I think is something that all of us have been talking about during this panel, right? But nonetheless, like, and this is something that I'm thinking about also in my current role, there were a lot of institutional barriers for us to really connect with community and to be welcoming to community and to really create and to lend empowerment and agency and to create very reciprocal relationships with them. And, you know, and these were sort of a lot of rules and regulations that were oftentimes imposed by the university itself. So they manifested themselves in like things like restrictive entrance policies. You know, we were the only institute within the library that was open to the general public, but then, you know, guards and, you know, or the change of guards would really sort of prove as a deterrent to that. And so oftentimes people would come to us and then later would not be able to get in and later on tell us that they were not able to get in. And then, you know, just things like a lack of university institutional support for collaborative initiatives, you know, or a funding landscape that emphasized really extractive collecting practices and lack of consistent funding and staffing. I myself was a project archivist for years and eventually had to leave because there was no money left, or supposedly no money left. And, you know, really sort of a landscape that even in the late 90s and early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, you know, sort of was not a very fertile environment for the documentation of BIPOC communities. There was this continued marginalization, both sort of within broader historical fields, but also within our own professions, and the sort of lack of, for lack of a better term, the lack of diversity that existed within our profession, and therefore lack of consciousness about the need to not only document BIPOC communities, but also really sort of connect in a very sort of tangible and intentional fashion with them. You know, what I've seen, you know, in sort of the expanse of my career, and, you know, I've been around for almost 20 years now, which is kind of crazy to me, so old, has been this sort of shift towards more towards community-driven and centered partnerships, as well as post-custodial approaches that really try to circumvent this traditional donor-repository relationship that, you know, that we, at least in sort of more university-based institutions, have inherited, right? And so, and this has been reflected in things like, you know, Mellon funding initiatives that are really focused on funding community institution-based institutions, or really emphasize collaborative, you know, more sort of profound and in-depth collaborative relationships. You know, and obviously, as many of you know, this is thanks to a lot of the sort of incredible work of Burgess Jules of the Shift Collective. But, you know, there's these really interesting projects happening at the University of California, Irvine, where our good friend Audrey Golyun is head of special collections, or at Arizona State University, where of course Nancy Liliana Godoy is doing incredible amounts of work in community-driven initiatives. And also in my parallel role as an archival educator, I've seen this in a lot of the students I've been teaching the past few years through UCLA or University of Washington, where they're really sort of, and granted those institutions have a much more sort of liberal bent perhaps, but, you know, there's this really sort of new generation of archivists that's coming up, not only that's younger, but also you see more BIPOC students, but also that's much more steeped in social justice and community archives considerations, and that are really sort of interrogating sort of more traditional, what are so-called traditional notions of archives in a much more sort of fruitful fashion, and sort of are from the get-go sort of being, you know, demanding of our profession, of our institutions, and of our practices more, right? They're demanding more in many respects, and sort of, and not really sort of settling for normative ways of conducting our profession, or really thinking about what an archive is, but also how archives relate to others outside of their institutional boundaries, right? And, you know, I'm very excited by that and hope to continue teaching, because it's just, it's a way to really get on the ground floor in many respects, and perhaps, you know, manipulate young minds in many ways. And I think it's incredibly, it's a sort of really important for us, for those of us who have perhaps come before or who are really sort of invested in working on these issues to really sort of raise them as sort of being central to the way we educate ourselves as archivists, not only sort of the training that we sort of provide young archivists with, but also moreover the kind of thinking or critical thinking skills that they bring to the profession, right? And in thinking about advocacy, also then sort of the scope of advocacy has really changed, I think, and my role in that has changed as well. So like there's way more interest now in sort of more grassroots institutional partners interested in reflecting BIPOC realities, and it may not seem that way, but I think, and I hate to sort of pull out the old dude card, but if you've been around for a while, and particularly if you've been a person of color in this field for like over 20 some odd years, I mean, when I spoke to my mentors at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, they were incredibly marginalized in archival spaces and professional spaces, and they really felt very much isolated in the kind of work that they're doing, super dedicated, but very isolated and not very supported by institutional structures or funders, right? I mean, they literally had to beg for money oftentimes. So I feel that this, although despite the fact that there's still, for me at least, insufficient amounts of BIPOC professionals and BIPOC individuals leading these initiatives and sort of doing justice to them, and nonetheless, like, there is like some shift in many ways in the kind of work that we do. But I think, for me, oftentimes, like, the leading question in a lot of this work is, how do we occupy historical spaces through empowering BIPOC communities, and sort of how do we further then interrogate institutional and professional divisions? I think one of the questions that I'm constantly asking myself, particularly in this new role, and certainly when I was at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and at the Bancroft, is what can we as institutionally based professionals, for lack of a better term, do to really sort of dissolve the boundaries that exist between us and our community partners, and wheedle them down as much as we can, so that we not only challenge sort of normative standards within our professions, but also the institutional boundaries or restrictions that are placed on us at our, universities and what have you. I know that I'm running out of time, but just a really quick note. In terms of my role here at Cal State LA, Cal State LA is, Special Collections and Archives at Cal State LA is really, really wonderful place in many respects. My colleague Azalea Camacho is part of this advocacy working group, and there was just really wonderful work being done here in terms of looking at the history of regional, it's really centered on community collecting and sort of regional histories in many respects. And I think as we move forward, there's really there's a strong focus on immigrants and communities of color, and local activists and heritage and women, LGBTQIA communities and BIPOC communities around here. I think one of the things that we've been very good about here is that really we're sort of very intentional about how we articulate our commitment to these groups and to these local communities and their empowerment through our mission and vision statements, and through sort of the formation of policies that have an impact on how we negotiate with donors, what our collection development, what our fundraising looks like, and what our even operations look like in many respects. And I think we're sort of undergoing this process where we're really sort of looking to sort of institutionalize those things in many respects and make them a part of our daily practice, like the kind of work that Lauren was articulating and that Jonna was articulating as well, where it's sort of really on the ground floor in many ways and woven throughout the fabric of your organization or your institution or repository, rather than it being sort of like a diversity collection add-on or whatever. It really is something that, as you move forward, is an ethical way in which you move forward. And sort of just a quick example of like how we're doing this. Obviously, this is an approach, and particularly when it comes to community partnerships and reciprocity, is an approach that we're taking with all of our partners in many ways. But recently, a few months ago, we were approached by one of our faculty members in the anthropology department, and he has an ongoing collaboration with this group called Speaking Place, and they've been working with this workshop, like a video workshop in Oaxaca. And it's an incredibly interesting project because they focus on sort of the documentation of linguistic differences and cultural practices and what have you. And I think this is really, we've been going through the development of the donor agreement in many respects, and what it's provided for us, it's really provided this really fantastic opportunity to look at the kind of language that we use in our agreements and how we negotiate with these different groups in order to give them the kind of space, not only sort of developing an agreement that's sort of an arrangement that's based on reciprocity, but also that really sort of recognizes their agency and sort of the rights involved, particularly for these indigenous groups, to restrict materials, for example. And thankfully, we have the protocols for Native American materials that were finally ratified in 2018. But this is really sort of serving as a great test for how we really rewrite our policies and rewrite our relationships in order to provide the maximum amount of agency and voice for the groups that we're negotiating our contracts with, for example. Now, just really quickly, I know I'm a little bit over time, but so already the scope of sort of our partnership and donor agreements are really changing, and so I think we're going forward. We really want to expand on what our relationships to donors are, and how we can really extend these collaborations to really dissolve those professional boundaries that exist between us and community-based organizations here in East Los Angeles and the San Gabriel Valley, where we're comfortably situated. I think by virtue of the fact that special collections and archives and this library are based at a state university where the students are predominantly BIPOC, the predominantly immigrant, and the predominantly first gen, we have to be very intentional and sort of cognizant of the fact that it's really important for us to move forward as if we were a community-based archive in many ways. And sort of how do we develop anti-institutional and sort of post-custodial arrangements, right? Like how do we work with communities and donors to retain agency and really the power of representation and self-determination. And sort of, and again, how do we author descriptive metadata with community input and do reparative metadata like many of our colleagues are doing across the country. But moreover, just in general, to look to foster a collaborative environment that, is really equitable and community-driven, empathetic, and committed to social justice. I think as we move forward and we really try to challenge those boundaries between our relationships with our donors, I think we really will manifest a very different future for ourselves at this institution, and hopefully for our donors as well. So that's all I have to say for now. My apologies, I went a minute or two over. I am loquacious. So I really look forward to our dialogue. Please ask us questions. I'm much more interested in hearing what you have to think and perhaps some of the work that you're doing. And I look forward to having a conversation with you as we move forward. Thanks so much.
Again, everyone, thank you so much for your presentations and thank you for your time. We are very lucky to have you here, Lauren, Jonna, and Mario, for the work that you do and the advice and the ideas that you kind of presented just in this last hour. I imagine that people have a lot of questions about this, and so we want to make sure that people have that opportunity. We have more than 20 minutes for people to put their questions in the chat, and or they can digitally raise their hands and we will call on them and we will be able to see them in the video, and people can just unmute at that point. And so again, we just want to say thank you. And while we're kind of waiting for people to process all of that information and get it all out into a question form, I will start because I had some thoughts that I wanted to kind of ask y'all about. Y'all,
we do have a question already.
Oh, we do? Okay, because
Yes,
I can go. So we should definitely go with someone from the chat. Go with it.
Okay, so we have, how do you take care of yourselves while doing this work?
I can jump off here. What really helps, as I mentioned, is we work in a collective and collaborative environment. And so I work, so for instance, I work with our two admin assistants, Daphne and Gabby, and they're just great. It's just great to have people you can be like, did you see what they wrote? Is this how we want to and to help take the, to help to get feedback on, to know that what's happening to you is actually happening and that you can respond in a way that doesn't that doesn't, you know, put up walls, but that can kind of move around that and actually get to the work you're doing. So being able to have peers, people to work with closely, to write with, I think that's important too. The process of going from a vinegar-filled reply to one that is building those collaborations is real. And I'm so appreciative to Gabby and Daphne work with on the daily, and then also to Gabrielle Foreman and Shirley Moody Turner and Jim Casey, who help think through these things and who are cheerleaders for you. And one thing we do in our weekly executive team meetings is we start off with lightning wins, like celebrating each other. Like, what did you get through? What did you finish? What happened? What did you take a nap? Like, just trying to create space to celebrate, so we can push through and see the humanity in each other. We're not just workers, we're people. So I'll end it there.
I'd say the same, is that I have the support of staff here, our curator of collections and our head curator. You know, we talk to each other, we get support from each other. And I also have a strong network of, you know, peers that I'm able to talk to and just, you know, get advice from and vent, you know, so yeah. I think it's all important in helping us stay centered and getting the work done.
Lots of Law and Order SVU on the weekends. But I think, you know, it's really, I would agree for sure with both Lauren and Jonna that, you know, I always tell people that my initial experience in archives, like I was mentioning earlier, at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, was really a truly wonderful experience in many ways. And once I left that very sort of very supportive, confined world, like I've been searching for that again, right? And I think there's really a wonderful opportunity. I have really wonderful colleagues here at Cal State LA in special collections, and there's really something to be said for working in a supportive environment where, you know, you may have different personalities or different sort of, you know, work paces, but nonetheless, like you're really focused on a very community-based mission, right, and community-driven mission. I think there's something really enriching of that for me, and I think I adore this kind of work, and I've been doing it for a little while, and you know, I think it's really just such a privilege in many ways, and then also such a privilege to work with people who really, you know, at their heart of hearts really care about this kind of work, right? And I think that's really something that's so critical for me, besides Law and Order SVU, to continue going, right? I think it's really hard in PWIs, and I think in other locations where you're really the only one doing this kind of work, and you're really struggling to legitimize the kind of work that you do, right? And I think, you know, we get plenty of that in the outside world, so it's really wonderful to come to work and to work with colleagues where, like, it's not a question that, you know, we are, you know, really dedicated to this kind of community-driven work, and this is where we're at.
Okay, the next question, how do you deal with pushback from folks either in your institution or in the field?
Anyone want to answer that? I don't want to talk too much. Like I said, I'm really loquacious, so stop me, please. Well, like I mentioned during my talk, like I find that, at least, you know, again, remember, I'm in a very specific kind of institution. I'm in an HSI. There are a lot of people of color on this campus, including academics of color, not as many as we should have. So I have found that the level of pushback, at least for me, and I live in a very urban environment, I live in Los Angeles, is not as much as I used to experience. And I think also just in the broader field, particularly as more like BIPOC folks get into positions of power within SAA, for example, I think we are shifting sort of the agenda and sort of how receptive our profession is to looking at difference, right? And sort of willingness to document difference or interest in documentaries or investment. So I don't personally, for now at least, receive a lot of pushback. And, but also, you know, I think, you know, I'm a man, I'm an older dude, I have a PhD. So I think that sort of garners some like legitimacy in people's eyes, unfortunately, that perhaps some of my other colleagues don't experience.
Yeah, I would say that I don't get so much pushback either here. I think it's more a lack of understanding what an archive does and what a library does. I mean, you know, you've got the perception, oh, you just go there to check out books, or, you know, you go to an archive and you can see anything. Well, you know, we're a small archive with a small staff. So, you know, as I mentioned, we have unprocessed collections. So what does it take to process a collection? You know, what is all of the steps you need to do to make that collection available for public access? You know, that's the metadata, that's the organizing and arrangement and such. And so I think it's more just understanding what my job is. And so I'm always talking about what I do. And, you know, just always talking about what I do. So yeah, that's my answer.
I think there's a lot of ways. I think the one I'll share with is I think it goes into building community. So building community, not with just the folks you're immediately working with, but within your department, your unit, and institutions in your college. And that's a long road to pave. It doesn't just happen. And it's not recognized, I think, particularly in the librarian field, like what it takes to engage faculty, to gain their trust, and to them then want to collaborate with you on something. That takes work, and that takes a set of skills that I alone don't have. So that's where the community work comes into. But I think it's the community building, and then people seeing what you're doing and how it impacts not just the work you're doing, but how it impacts the field. How, you know, when they start seeing, you know, people, local community members coming into the building for events that they could never get to before, they start to see that in real time. And I mentioned the community building's not recognized. I don't think, it does not seem to be recognized in libraries. And it's something I wrote into my job description. So it is something I will have to be reviewed on. And I think that's another way to signal, like, all the other work I do doesn't get done unless you're building community and you're gaining people's trust. And so we'll see how that goes. I think it's going okay, but I don't know. I think it's also, and if people just don't want to be involved or aren't interested, then that's their thing. You know, I have things to do, so I'm going to do it, and people can come and build with us, and, you know, be in community with us. So yeah, I think it's just the relationship building and the community building, to whatever extent that can happen with people who want to be involved.
Okay, what are your policies for using volunteers?
We have a center-wide policy on using volunteers. So I believe they have to do a background check now. So, but in the library and archives, you know, I welcome anybody who wants to come and work and try to match them to whatever skills that they have. And so, you know, I have some ladies that do are reading some of the lectures that were presented here at the center and writing a short synopsis of them so that that can be used for access, but she doesn't type. So another lady does the typing of those the work that she's doing. So, that's I welcome anybody. So that's my policy.
Okay, there's one on what's your advice on practicing reparative descriptions in an archival collection?
That is a good question. Thank you. As I mentioned, we're new to this. I'm new to this. I've only been in the library here for a little over 2 years, and most of that was, half of that was because of COVID. So I was alone for about 15 months and working from home, working here at the center by myself, and getting reacquainted with the collections and with the work. And then I had staff that finally returned in June of last year. So, we've been just doing one thing at a time. And I haven't had the opportunity really yet to create any descriptive metadata for archives other than the oral history project that was put online. So I don't have too much advice I can prepared to give, I guess, at this point. So, thank you.
Okay, any recommendations on continuing education for the career changes, or maybe because the field is, I guess, changing in some ways? Like, what are some recommendations to gain more experience?
I can take that. And so, well, obviously, not only your sort of regional and local archival organizations oftentimes have opportunities for continuing education or lectures or reading groups or what have you that will sort of further your knowledge about the field and about the changes in the field. There's also obviously the Rare Book School that is holding this particular talk or panel. I'm potentially teaching also in the summer for the California Rare Book School, which is headed by my good friend Rob Montoya. So I think there are a number of opportunities, to sort of shift those narratives. Obviously, the site American Archivist, I would be bereft if I didn't mention them as well. So there are a number of sort of additional opportunities, sometimes, citing scale, sometimes paid, obviously, sometimes no fee, that are available to you in order to sort of really inform your thinking about archives and special collections in particular. At least that's my wheelhouse. And obviously there are a number of robust, there's a robust level of publications available. The field has changed quite a bit in the last decade or so, at least 10, 15 years, where you have more individuals who have PhDs in information studies, for example, who are teaching in library schools. And so therefore, rather than being historians or what have you, or some individuals who've done it sort of as a secondary practice or a form of scholarship, there are a number of people who, whose scholarship circulates around archives, right? And especially around special collections. And, and just go into Google Scholar and, do some searches. Obviously, there are some individuals that we can mention who I know and love, who are really great, who are sort of contributing really wonderful work to the field. And so there's really a number of different ways. And I think, and Zoom obviously has provided us opportunities to attend a number of lectures and talks that, I attend quite a few, and they're really sort of, I've learned about colleagues who are doing really wonderful, like Jonna and Lauren, who I didn't know about previously. So those are some of my recommendations.
As I said, I'm new to library and archives, so I you can't learn everything in school. So I do a lot of online classes with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They have a lot of library and archives topics at a nice, reasonable price. So that's where I do a lot of my continuing education from.
Pedrosa, I think we probably have time for one more question before we gotta close it out. And you're on mute.
The last one I see is, again, how do you navigate faculty being resistant toward acknowledging the work we do for them in their publications?
Man, hitting them with the zinger at the end.
I don't know. I personally have not run into that challenge. I was about to say beat them over the head, but that's abdicating violence. I don't mean to do that. I think it's I think that's sort of a symptom of a broader issue of the lack of recognition of archival and librarian labor, right? Which I think, there are a number of people I recognize in this Zoom room who have done really wonderful work in those areas, and I would encourage you to read them. I think that's the symptom of it. I think one of the issues on our campus, obviously, is despite the fact that we're, oftentimes you hear that despite the fact that we're recognized as we're classified as faculty, forgive me, it's instructional faculty, as they're termed, don't sort of recognize the labor that librarians and archivists, or the scholarship of librarian archivists within the institution, right? And sort of take us seriously. And so that's, I think, indicative of this question of the fact that people are not cited and, their work is not recognized is a symptom, as a sort of a broader symptom of that. And the fact that, as many of us in this call know, there's this whole sort of notion amongst, some of our scholars or faculty in particular, that they've discovered certain collections. And there's this complete sort of occlusion of labor that went into helping them discover that, helping them locate that material, right? Sort of the behind the scenes, the processing, which, my colleague Azalea and I are sort of demonstrating to some folks now, and they're just like, oh, I didn't realize that all of that went into that box that was served up to me. And I'm like, that's right. It's not just presto changeo, you've discovered this collection. So I think it's a broader issue, right? That we need to address in terms of just the sort of erasure of the labor of archivists and the labor that goes into making a lot of these, and money that goes into making our collections accessible to researchers and to the broader public.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming. That has to be the last question because we are coming up on 3:30 Eastern time. And I just want to extend one more great thank you to the panelists, Lauren Cooper, Jonna Paden, and Mario Ramirez, for their incredible presentations and for really just extending their time in this way. We really appreciate it. And again, to Rare Book School, the Andrew Mellon Cultural Heritage Fellowship, staff, and to my fellow advocacy working group members. Again, thank you so much for all the work that you've done putting this together, and hope that we can do more of this in the future. If you have any additional questions, all the participants will get a link to the Pub publication, as well as information about emails and videos that this was recorded on. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.